The supercharged whine of the Ram 1500 TRX didn't just break the silence of Blackwood Creek, it violated it. It was a sound that cost 6 figures, a predatory mechanical scream that cut through the freezing January fog like a chainsaw through bone. The Hellcat engine idled with a deep subsonic thrum that shook the frost off the dead pine trees lining the road. Here, in the hollowed-out chest of the Rust Belt, where the only things growing were rust and opioid addictions, Mason Thorne's truck looked less like a vehicle and more like an invading spacecraft. Mason killed the engine. The sudden silence was heavier than the noise. He stepped out into the slush, his custom leather boots crunching violently against the frozen mud. He wasn't wearing a suit. Mason didn't play by Wall Street rules. He wore the armor of the new American king, a heavy shearling-lined coat over tailored canvas workwear that cost more than the average local's annual disability check. On his left wrist, a Patek Philippe ticked loudly, a $60,000 heartbeat against the desolate quiet of the West Virginia border. He didn't look like a man returning home. He looked like a man who had spent the last 4 years fracking natural gas out of the earth and crushing unions with his bare hands. His eyes, cold and hard as anthracite coal, locked onto the structure in front of him, the Vance family farmhouse. 4 years ago, this Victorian house had been the crown jewel of the county, a pristine white fortress of old money pride. Now, it was a rotting carcass. The porch sagged like a broken jaw, the white paint was peeling in leprosy-like strips, and the windows were dark, staring back at him like hollow sockets. And there it was, stapled to the rotting fence post, flapping pathetically in the biting wind, an orange foreclosure notice. Bank seizure set for tomorrow, 8:00 a.m. Mason's lip curled. A muscle in his jaw jumped. The sight of the collapsing porch swing triggered the memory instantly, hitting him with the force of a sledgehammer. The freezing rain of 4 years ago, the smell of wet wool and humiliation. He had been a 22-year-old mechanic then, standing in this exact spot, his hands stained with grease that no amount of scrubbing could remove. Arthur Vance, the foreman, had stood on that porch, looking down at him like he was something he'd scraped off his boot. "You want my daughter, grease monkey?" Arthur had spat, the saliva landing near Mason's muddy work boots. "Lily doesn't marry debt. She marries security. You want her? You bring me $50,000 cash in a duffel bag. Until then, stay in the gutter where you belong." 50,000. It might as well have been 50 million to a boy fixing radiators for minimum wage. 2 weeks later, Lily was gone. The town gossip said she'd climbed into a black Lincoln Town car, headed for a penthouse in Manhattan and a banker husband, leaving Mason to drown in the mud. Mason reached into the passenger seat of the truck and hauled out a tactical black duffel bag. It was heavy. Inside, stacked in tight rubber-banded bricks, was $500,000 in cold, hard cash. He hadn't come to save the house. He hadn't come to play the hero. He was here to buy the deed at dawn, burn it in front of the old man's face, and evict the last Vance into the snow. He wanted Arthur to feel the cold. He wanted to watch the hope flicker out of the old man's eyes, just as it had been extinguished in his own. Mason slammed the truck door. The sound echoed like a gunshot across the valley. He began to walk toward the rotting porch, the snow yielding under his feet, a predator finally closing in on a wounded, dying animal. The oak door, once a polished barrier that had slammed in his face a dozen times during his youth, offered no resistance. Mason didn't bother with the handle. He didn't knock. He wasn't a guest. He was the executioner, coming to collect a debt written in 4 years of silence. He lifted his heavy boot and drove the heel into the wood just below the lock mechanism. There was no sharp crack of solid timber. Instead, the frame gave way with a wet, sickening crunch. The wood was soft, spongy with rot, exploding inward in a shower of splintered varnish and rust. The door swung open, banging against the interior wall and staying there, crooked on its hinges. Mason stepped across the threshold, bringing the freezing January air in with him. The silence inside was different from the silence outside. Outside, it was the clean, cold silence of winter. Inside, the air was heavy, thick, and suffocating. It hit Mason like a physical wave, a miasma of stale bourbon, sour, unwashed laundry, and the damp, mushroomy stench of creeping black mold. It was the smell of a life that had stopped moving forward and started to decompose. He clicked on his tactical flashlight. The beam, bright enough to blind a deer at 200 yards, sliced through the gloom, revealing the corpse of the Vance home. The grand foyer where Lily used to polish the banister until it gleamed like obsidian was a landfill. Pizza boxes from months ago were stacked in leaning towers. Crushed beer cans carpeted the floor, glinting aluminum amidst piles of unopened junk mail. Final notices, warnings, threats from the bank. The expensive Persian rug, once the centerpiece of Arthur's pride, was stained dark with grease and God knows what else, curled at the edges like a dying leaf. Mason walked deeper, his boots heavy on the floorboards. Groan, creak, groan. The house sounded like it was in pain. He swept the light to the left toward the hallway leading to the downstairs master bedroom. He stopped dead. The chaos of the living room ended abruptly at that hallway. What stood there wasn't trash. It was a fortification. The entrance to the hallway was barricaded, not just locked, but sealed. Heavy oak furniture, a dresser, a bookshelf, a heavy dining chair had been dragged and piled up to block the path. But it wasn't just furniture. Planks of rough 2x4s had been nailed across the gaps in a frantic, maniacal crisscross pattern. The nails were driven in deep, some bent, some straight, clustered together in knots of steel. It looked less like a renovation and more like a desperate attempt to keep something out, or keep something in. It was the architecture of insanity, a wooden scar on the house's interior. "What are you hiding, old man?" Mason thought, his grip tightening on the duffel bag. "Money? The cash you sold her for?" A sound from the kitchen, a sharp scrape of metal on linoleum, snapped Mason's attention away from the barricade. He spun around, leveling the flashlight beam toward the kitchen doorway like the barrel of a gun. "Who's there?" Mason's voice was low, gravelly, leaving no room for negotiation. Movement. A shadow detached itself from the darkness near the refrigerator. Arthur Vance emerged into the halo of light. The memory Mason held of Arthur, the broad-shouldered, iron-fisted foreman who ruled the coal tipple, with a terrifying glare, evaporated instantly. The man standing in the kitchen was a ghost haunting his own skin. Arthur was skeletal. His skin was gray and translucent, stretched tight over cheekbones that protruded like blades. He wore a pair of filthy thermal long johns that hung loosely off his wasted frame, stained with food and grime. His hair, once thick and silver, was now a patchy, matted mess of white wisps. He looked like the meth addicts Mason saw twitching outside the gas stations, on the county line, gaunt, hollowed out, vibrating with a frantic chemical energy. In his shaking hand, Arthur clutched a rusted tire iron, raising it feebly to shield his eyes from the blinding LED light. "Get out!" Arthur croaked. His voice was a dry rattle, devoid of the booming authority it once commanded. "Looters! I told you. Nothing left." Mason lowered the light slightly, letting it sweep down the old man's body. That's when he saw it. Arthur's left leg was a ruin. It was twisted at a sickening, unnatural angle beneath the knee, the foot dragging uselessly behind him like dead weight. There was no cast, no hospital boot. Instead, the leg was encased in a crude, horrifying brace made of gray PVC pipe and layers of duct tape. It was a backyard surgery job, a testament to a man who hadn't seen a doctor or hadn't been able to afford one in years. Mason felt a jolt of revulsion mixed with a strange, cold shock. This was the man who had demanded $50,000 for his daughter's hand? This broken scarecrow living in squalor? Mason took a step forward, the floorboards complaining under his weight. He aimed the light back at Arthur's face. "Drop the iron, Arthur." At the sound of his name, and the familiarity of the voice, Arthur Vance froze. He blinked, his pupils pinpoint small in the harsh light, trying to process the figure standing in his kitchen. He squinted past the glare, seeing the expensive shearling coat, the clean jawline, the eyes that hadn't changed since that day in the mud. The tire iron slipped from Arthur's fingers. It hit the linoleum with a dull, heavy clang that echoed through the empty house. Arthur didn't scream. He didn't lunge. He didn't reach for a weapon. His mouth fell open, revealing gums that were bleeding and teeth that had seen better days. But the look in his eyes wasn't the fear of a homeowner confronting an intruder. It was the terrified recognition of a sinner confronting his reckoning. He backed up until his spine hit the refrigerator, sliding down an inch as if his legs had turned to water. He stared at Mason not as a man, but as a natural disaster that had finally made landfall. "Mason," Arthur whispered, the name leaving his lips like a curse he had been expecting for 4 years. You shouldn't be here. Oh God, not you. I'm exactly where I need to be, Arthur. And I'm about 4 years late." Mason didn't offer a hand to help the old man up. Instead, he swung the heavy tactical duffel bag onto the kitchen table. It landed with a dense, flat thud that shook a half-empty bottle of bourbon near the edge. Mason reached out and ripped the zipper open. The fabric screamed in protest before the bag split wide, vomiting its contents onto the sticky, stained tablecloth. Stacks of $100 bills, bricks of them, bound in tight bank bands, smelling of ink and federal authority. "Look at it," Mason commanded, his voice devoid of warmth. "You wanted 50,000? There's $500,000, Arthur, cold, hard, cash." Arthur flinched as if Mason had thrown a bucket of boiling water at him. He stared at the money, the green mountains that could fix his leg, pay off the bank, and heat this freezing mausoleum for a decade, but his eyes held no avarice, only a widening, consuming horror. "I bought the debt," Mason continued, leaning over the table, his shadow swallowing the shivering man on the floor. "I own the deed at 8 a.m., but I'm generous. You have 1 hour, pack your trash, grab your pills, take the money, and get out. Go find a trailer park that takes cripples and burnouts." "Mason, you don't understand," Arthur stammered, his gaze darting frantically from the cash to the barricaded hallway. "Oh, he understands just fine, honey. He just took the long way round to finding out." The voice came from the broken front door. Mason didn't turn. He knew that voice. It was the screeching timbre of Mrs. Higgins, the neighbor who lived for other people's misery. She was standing on the porch, wrapped in a pink bathrobe and clutching a cigarette, peering through the splintered doorframe like a vulture inspecting roadkill. "Don't waste your breath on him, Mason," Mrs. Higgins called out, her voice cutting through the tension. She stepped inside, uninvited, her eyes feasting on the piles of cash. "Old man's lost his damn mind since Lily ran off, brains fried." Mason's jaw tightened. "Get out, Gladys." "I'm just telling you the truth," she huffed, gesturing with her cigarette toward Arthur. "The whole town knows it. Lily got picked up in a black Lincoln Town car 4 years ago, shinier than a hearse, never looked back, not once." She let out a dry, hacking laugh. "Left her daddy with a pile of hush money and he gambled it all away on horses and liquor within 6 months. That's why he boards up the rooms. Paranoia. Thinks the loan sharks are coming back for the rest." Mason looked down at Arthur. The story fit. It fit the narrative that had fueled Mason's rage for 1,460 nights. The greedy father, the gold-digging daughter, the collapse of a moral vacuum. "Is that true, Arthur?" Mason asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You gambled away the price of your daughter?" Arthur made a sound that wasn't human. It was a gurgle, a wet heave from deep in his diaphragm. He didn't grab the cash. He didn't curse the neighbor. He turned his head and vomited violently onto the linoleum floor. Bile and fear splattered next to his ruined leg. Then he did the unthinkable. Arthur Vance, the man who used to stride through the coal tipple like a god, began to crawl. He dragged his duct-tape leg across the filthy floor, ignoring the vomit, ignoring the humiliation. He reached out with trembling skeletal hands and grabbed the toe of Mason's boot. "Take it back," Arthur sobbed, his face pressed against the dirty leather of Mason's shoe. "Take the money back, Mason. Burn the house. Burn it all down with me inside. Just, please, go away." Mason stood frozen. This wasn't the reaction of a man who sold his child for profit. A greedy man would be stuffing his pockets. A desperate junkie would be crying with relief. Arthur was crying with terror. "Please," Arthur wheezed, looking up, tears cutting tracks through the grime on his face. "If you ever loved her, if you ever gave a damn about my little girl, don't open that door. Don't go in that room. Leave me here to rot. Just leave." The neighbor, Mrs. Higgins, fell silent, her cigarette burning down to the filter. Even she sensed that the script had gone wrong. This wasn't the rambling of a drunk. This was the pleading of a man guarding the gates of hell. Mason looked at the barricaded hallway, the 2x4s, the heavy dresser, the frantic nails. Mrs. Higgins said he was hiding from loan sharks. Arthur acted like he was hiding a monster. But Mason knew one thing about fear. It usually guarded the truth. "If you didn't gamble the money, Arthur," Mason said, kicking his boot free from the old man's grasp, "then what exactly are you protecting in there?" "No!" Arthur shrieked as Mason stepped over him. "Mason, don't! It'll kill you! The truth will kill you!" Mason didn't stop. He walked past the table of money, $500,000 that meant absolutely nothing to the man on the floor, and headed straight for the barricade. The mystery wasn't in the bank account. It was behind the timber and the nails, and Mason was done paying for secrets. The sledgehammer was leaning against the peeling wallpaper in the hallway, a rusted relic of a time when this house was being built, not destroyed. It was a 10-pound brutalist tool with a hickory handle, smooth from years of sweat and labor. Mason didn't hesitate. He ignored the wet, desperate sounds of Arthur Vance crawling behind him. He ignored the warnings that sounded more like the prayers of a condemned man. Mason reached out and wrapped his hand around the handle. It felt heavy, balanced, and lethal. It felt like the only language this house would understand. "Mason, no, you can't!" Arthur shrieked from the floor, his voice cracking into a high, thin wail. "It's a tomb. Leave it be." Mason didn't turn around. He stepped up to the barricade, that ugly, chaotic weave of 2x4s and furniture blocking the master bedroom. It was a wooden scar tissue over a wound that had never healed. He swung. Crack. The head of the sledgehammer impacted the first plank with the force of a car crash. The dry, aged wood didn't just break, it exploded. Splinters the size of daggers flew into the air, dusting Mason's expensive shearling coat in sawdust. The noise was deafening in the confined hallway, a violent percussion that silenced the wind outside. Mason swung again and again. He wasn't just breaking wood, he was smashing 4 years of silence. He was breaking the nights he spent sleeping in his truck. He was smashing the memory of Lily walking away. Each impact sent a shockwave up his arms, vibrating through his bones, fueling the adrenaline that surged through his veins. Smash. The heavy dresser blocking the bottom groaned and shifted. Smash. The drywall around the frame crumbled, exposing the dark studs underneath. Then he paused. Through the jagged hole he had punched in the center of the barricade, a draft of air escaped. Mason expected the smell of rot. He expected the dead, musk-heavy scent of rats or mold, the smell of a room that had been shut up to hide a corpse. Instead, the air that hit his face was shocking in its purity. It smelled of lavender. Not the cheap synthetic air freshener smell. It was the smell of crushed flowers and essential oils. Underneath that was the sharp, stinging bite of clinical antiseptic rubbing alcohol and bleach. It was the smell of a hospital disguised as a garden. It was Lily's smell. The scent hit Mason harder than the physical labor. It stopped his heart for a singular, terrifying beat. The sledgehammer hung heavy in his hand. Why would a boarded-up room in a meth den farmhouse smell like his ex-girlfriend's neck? "She made me promise!" The scream came from right behind his knees. Arthur had dragged himself within striking distance. With a burst of hysterical strength, the crippled old man lunged, wrapping his skeletal arms around Mason's legs, trying to tackle him, trying to weigh him down. "Don't go in," Arthur sobbed, burying his face in Mason's coat. "Profound sanctity. Don't defile it. Please, boy, please." Mason didn't feel anger anymore. He felt a cold, creeping dread. He looked down at the weeping man, then back at the dark hole emitting that haunting perfume. "Get off me, Arthur," Mason said. His voice was no longer a growl. It was flat, dead calm. He didn't kick the old man this time. He simply leaned forward, using his massive leverage to pry Arthur's weak grip loose. He shoved the old man aside, not gently, but not violently. Arthur slid across the floorboards, collapsing against the wall, weeping into his hands. Mason turned back to the door. He raised his boot and delivered one final, crushing kick to the lock mechanism. The door flew open. Mason raised his tactical flashlight. The beam cut into the darkness. He stepped inside. The transition was instant and jarring. He had left a filthy, rotting squatter's den and stepped into a vacuum. The room was clinically, obsessively clean. The floorboards had been scrubbed so hard the varnish was gone, leaving bleached, raw wood. The windows were completely blacked out with heavy tar paper and duct tape, sealing the space from the outside world, trapping the time inside. There was no dust, not a speck, but there was no bed. The four-poster bed where Lily's mother had died, where Lily had been conceived, it was gone. In the center of the room, illuminated by Mason's trembling flashlight beam, stood a glass display case. It looked like something stolen from a high-end boutique or a museum, totally out of place in this poverty. And inside the case was a dress. Mason's breath caught in his throat. He knew that dress. It was a simple white cotton sundress with small blue flowers embroidered on the hem. Lily had worn it on their first date to the county fair, eating funnel cake on the hood of his truck. But it looked wrong. Mason stepped closer, drawn by a magnetic, sickening curiosity. He shined the light directly on the fabric. The dress had been altered. The waistline had been ripped open. Panels of mismatched, cheaper white fabric had been hand-stitched into the sides, clumsy, jagged stitches made by shaking hands. The dress had been expanded, widened. It wasn't just a dress anymore. It was a tent. It had been modified to fit a woman who was heavily, undeniably pregnant. Mason stared at the empty fabric, his mind trying to reconcile the timeline. 4 years. She left 4 years ago. The math swirled in his head, colliding with the smell of antiseptic and the silence of the room. He lowered the flashlight, his hand shaking so badly the beam danced across the floor. He turned to look at Arthur, who was curled in the doorway, unable to cross the threshold, weeping the tears of a man who had held a secret too heavy for his soul. "Arthur," Mason whispered, the words scraping out of his throat like sandpaper. "Whose dress is that?" Arthur didn't answer. He was weeping into his hands in the hallway, a wretched, broken sound that offered no clarity. Mason turned away from the doorway, his boots feeling heavy as lead anchors. He moved deeper into the sterile vacuum of the room. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness like a scalpel, dissecting the secrets that had been preserved in this airless chamber for years. He moved past the glass display case and the tragic, altered dress. To his right, a small bedside table sat waiting, arranged with the precision of an altar. A vase of lavender sat there. The flowers were long dead, dried into brittle gray skeletons that crumbled if the air shifted too hard. Beside them was a silver frame. Mason aimed the light at the photograph. He braced himself. He expected to see Lily on a yacht in the Hamptons. He expected to see her wrapped in furs, holding a champagne flute, smiling that dazzling smile at some faceless Wall Street husband. He expected the visual proof of the betrayal that had fueled his cold, relentless climb to the top. But the woman in the photo wasn't a trophy wife. She was a ghost. It was Lily, yes, but she was sitting in a wheelchair in what looked like a hospital garden. Her golden hair, the hair Mason used to bury his face in, was gone. Her head was bald, pale, and fragile. Her skin was translucent, the blue veins beneath visible like a road map of suffering. A clear tube ran from her nose, taped to her cheek. An IV drip stand loomed behind her like a grim reaper, but she was smiling. It wasn't a smile of joy, it was a smile of defiance. Her hand was resting protectively, lovingly on the swell of her stomach. Mason felt the blood drain from his face, leaving him cold and dizzy. The floor seemed to tilt beneath him. Cancer, his mind whispered. The word landing with the weight of a stone. She didn't go to New York. He shifted the light, his hand trembling violently now. On the wall above the table hung a calendar. It wasn't from this year. It wasn't even from last year. 2022. The pages had been torn away month by month until October. The days were marked off with black X's, a countdown to oblivion. But one date, October 14th, was circled in thick red marker. Inside the circle, 2 words were written in Lily's neat, looping handwriting. Due date, goodbye. Mason stared at the red ink until it blurred. The math crashed into him. She had left him 4 years ago. This calendar was from 2 years later. She hadn't vanished into a life of luxury. She had been alive somewhere, suffering for 2 years, while he cursed her name to the empty passenger seat of his truck. His grip on the sledgehammer failed. Clang. The heavy steel head hit the floorboards. The sound was deafening in the small room, echoing like a gunshot that signaled the end of a war Mason didn't know he was fighting. He stumbled toward the dresser. It was covered in a pharmacy's worth of orange plastic bottles. In Blackwood Creek, where addiction was the local religion, these bottles were currency. People killed for them. Mason shined the light on the labels. OxyContin, morphine sulfate, fentanyl transdermal system. The dosages were high, terminal high, enough to put down a horse. But then Mason saw the caps. The safety seals were unbroken. The foil was intact. The bottles were full. Why? Mason's mind screamed. Why would you have these and not take them? He looked back at the photo. The bald head, the IV, the hand on the stomach. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow to the gut. He grabbed the edge of the dresser to keep from falling. Chemotherapy kills fast-dividing cells. It kills cancer. It also kills fetuses. Opioids cross the placenta. They stop the baby's heart. She hadn't taken the drugs. She hadn't taken the chemo. She had sat in this room or a room like it, letting the cancer eat her spine and consume her bones, feeling every single second of the agony, raw and unfiltered. She had chosen torture. She had chosen to be a human shield for the life growing inside her. Mason. Arthur's voice drifted in from the hallway, weak and terrified. Look under the bed. Mason dropped to his knees. He didn't care about the expensive trousers or the dust. He shined the light under the frame of where the bed used to be. There was a simple cardboard box. Written on the lid in black Sharpie was a single word, Mason. He dragged it out. His hands were shaking so bad he could barely lift the lid. Inside, there was no money. There were no deeds. It was filled with bottles of prenatal vitamins, stacks of them, and nestled on top was a glossy brochure, wrinkled from being held too tight. St. Jude's Hospice for the Destitute, Appalachian chapter. Mason stared at the brochure. Hospice for the Destitute. A place for people with no money, no insurance, and no hope. She hadn't married a banker. She hadn't taken a dime of the ransom money Arthur had demanded. She had died in a charity ward, likely freezing, likely alone, saving every penny for... Mason looked at the prenatal vitamins, then at the altered dress, then at the date on the calendar. She hadn't just left him. She had run away to save his child. The air in the room seemed to vanish. Mason Thorne, the man who could buy this whole town twice over, felt poorer than he had ever been in his life. The hate that had sustained him, the rage that had built his empire, crumbled into dust, leaving only a gaping, bleeding wound in his chest. He wasn't the victim. He never was. He was the reason she died in pain. Beneath the glossy brochure for the hospice and the unopened bottles of prenatal vitamins, Mason's fingers brushed against something cold and textured. He pulled it out. It was a journal. Bound in cracked black leather, the corners worn down to the cardboard, it looked less like a diary and more like a holy scripture that had been carried through a war zone. An elastic band held it shut, strained against the warped pages inside. Mason sat back on his heels, the floorboards digging into his knees. His hands, which could tear apart a transmission or strangle a man, were shaking so violently he could barely undo the strap. He opened the cover. The smell of old paper and that faint, haunting lavender scent drifted up. The first page was dated 4 years ago. The handwriting was Lily's neat, looping cursive. The kind of penmanship practiced in school notebooks. It was steady. It was resolved. Entry. 1. November 12th, 2019, I saw the doctor again today. Stage 4. It's in the marrow. He gave me 6 months with chemo, maybe 3 without. He told me to get my affairs in order. My affairs? My only affair is Mason. I looked at him tonight when he came home from the garage. He had grease under his fingernails and that exhausted look in his eyes, but he smiled when he saw me. He talked about buying a new lift, about opening his own shop one day. He has so much fire in him, so much future. If I tell him I'm dying, he will burn that future to the ground. He'll sell his tools. He'll sell his truck. He'll go into debt to pay for treatments that won't save me, just to keep me around for a few more agonizing weeks. He will bankrupt his life for a ghost. I can't let him do that. I love him too much to let him die with me. I have to make him hate me. Hate is a better fuel than grief. Hate burns hot. It drives you. Grief just suffocates you. I told Dad what to do. I told him to ask for the money, $50,000. I know Mason doesn't have it. I know it will break him. But one day, he'll use that anger to build an empire. He'll be safe. He'll be rich. And he won't be crying over a girl who was doomed anyway. Mason let out a ragged breath, a sound like a lung collapsing. The anger that had powered him for 4 years, the rage that woke him up at 4 a.m. and kept him working until midnight, wasn't his own. It was a gift. A terrible, sacrificial gift she had planted in his chest to save him from ruin. He flipped the pages. Time moved forward. The handwriting began to change. The loops got smaller, tighter. Entry 2, November 28, 2019. The town is talking. Mrs. Higgins is spreading rumors. Good, let them talk. The black car is coming tomorrow. It's not a banker. It's Father John from the Hospice of Our Lady. He's driving the parish Lincoln. It's funny. Everyone thinks I'm leaving to live in a penthouse. I'm going to a room with no view in the mountains to die. I packed my white dress, the one Mason likes. It's the only thing I'm taking. I left the rest. I don't need clothes where I'm going. Goodbye, Mason. Please hate me. Please become the man I know you can be. Don't look back. Mason wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, smearing dust and tears across his face. He turned more pages. The ink became sporadic. There were gaps of weeks. The handwriting deteriorated into jagged, spiky scrawls. The letters digging deep into the paper as if the writer was bearing down to fight through tremors. Entry 3, June 2022. The fire is in my spine now. It feels like someone is pouring molten lead down my back every time I move. My legs don't work anymore. The doctors are begging me. They want to induce labor. They want to start the morphine. They say the baby is barely viable, but I am suffering too much. I looked at the ultrasound today. He has Mason's chin. He's fighting in there. He's kicking. If I take the pills, his heart stops. If I do the chemo, he withers. I told them no. I told them to give me a towel to bite on. I can take it. I have to take it. Mason would take it for me. I just close my eyes and think of the day at the county fair, the funnel cake, the way he looked at me in the sunset. The pain is white hot, but the memory is cool. I can't take the drugs. Not yet. Not until he breathes. Mason stopped reading. He couldn't breathe. The image of Lily, sweet, gentle Lily, biting on a towel, her body ravaged by cancer, refusing relief to protect the spark of life inside her. It was too much. The man who had stared down union mobs, who had walked into bank boardrooms and terrified executives, who had built a reputation as unshakable iron, crumbled. He didn't just cry, he collapsed. Mason curled forward, his forehead hitting the floorboards next to the altered dress. He clutched the journal to his chest as if it were her physical body. A sound tore out of his throat, a primal guttural roar of agony that vibrated the glass of the display case. It was the sound of a man realizing that while he was busy conquering the world to prove her wrong, she was quietly conquering hell to save his bloodline. He lay there in the dust, the millionaire in the ruins, utterly destroyed by the truth. The sound of dragging plastic against wood broke the heavy silence of the room. Scrape. Thud. Scrape. Mason didn't look up. He was still on his knees, clutching the leather journal to his chest, his forehead resting against the cold floorboards. The grief was a physical weight, pinning him down, pressing the air out of his lungs. Arthur Vance pulled himself across the threshold. He didn't look like a monster anymore. He looked like a casualty of war. He dragged his ruined leg, the one encased in duct tape and PVC pipe, until he was sitting against the wall just a few feet from where Mason knelt. "You asked about the leg," Arthur whispered. His voice was no longer the high-pitched whine of a terrified man. It was hollow, exhausted, stripped of all pretense. Mason slowly lifted his head. His eyes were red, swollen, and terrifyingly empty. He looked at the makeshift brace on Arthur's shin. "Gambling debt," Mason rasped, repeating the town rumor Mrs. Higgins had spat out on the porch. "Did they break it because you couldn't pay?" Arthur let out a dry, rattling laugh that turned into a cough. "Gambling? God, I wish it was. That would be easier to live with." He reached down and patted the duct tape. February 2022. The blizzard of 22. You remember it? Shut down the interstate for 3 days. Arthur stared at the blacked-out window as if he could see the storm through the tar paper. Lily, she was craving peaches, fresh peaches. She hadn't eaten solid food in a week, but she woke up crying for them, said they reminded her of summer. Arthur swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his scrawny throat. My truck blew a transmission 10 miles from the hospice. The roads were ice. No tow trucks were running. But she wanted peaches, Mason, so I walked. Mason stared at him. 10 miles, in a blizzard, up the Appalachian ridges. I made it to the store, got the fruit. On the way back up the mountain, I slipped on Black Bear Ridge, fell 30 feet down into the ravine. Bones snapped right through the skin. Arthur's voice didn't waver. I dragged myself the last 4 miles in the snow. I crawled, Mason, just like I crawled to you in the kitchen tonight. I got her the damn peaches. Mason felt a fresh wave of nausea. The image of this frail man, broken and bleeding in the snow, crawling for miles just to give his dying daughter a taste of summer. It shattered the last remnants of Mason's hate. I set the bone myself, Arthur murmured. Couldn't go to the hospital, couldn't spend the money. Every dime I had, every dime from the house, the furniture I sold, it all went to the sisters, to keep her comfortable, to keep him safe. Mason's head snapped up. Him? Arthur didn't speak. He reached out with a trembling hand and pointed to the journal Mason was still clutching. "Turn the page, son. The last one." Mason's fingers felt numb, clumsy blocks of wood. He fumbled with the paper, turning past Lily's final, agony-filled entry. There was a new handwriting on the back cover. It wasn't Lily's loop, and it wasn't Arthur's shaky scrawl. It was precise, old-fashioned script. February 14th, 2023, 3:14 a.m. Lily Vance passed peacefully into the arms of the Lord. Her pain is ended. She held the child for 2 minutes. She kissed his forehead. Her last words were a prayer for the builder. "We have named him Scout because he is a survivor. He is small, but he has his father's lungs. Sister Margaret, Convent of Our Lady of the Mountains." "Scout," Mason whispered. The name hung in the sterile air. A survivor. He looked at Arthur. "He's alive?" "He's 4 years old," Arthur said, tears finally spilling over his grime-streaked cheeks. "He's up at the convent. The sisters, they're raising him. I couldn't bring a newborn here, Mason. Look at this place, no heat, no food. I'm a cripple who eats cat food to survive. I would have killed him." "Why?" Mason roared, the sound tearing out of his throat. He scrambled to his feet, towering over the old man. "Why didn't you call me? I was in Pittsburgh. I was building skyscrapers. I could have hired the best doctors. I could have saved her. I could be raising him." Arthur didn't flinch. He looked up at Mason with a sad, terrible pity. "Because she forbade it." Arthur reached into his dirty thermal shirt and pulled out a folded, stained piece of paper. He held it up. "She made me swear on her soul. She said you were building a life. She said if you knew she was sick, you'd stop building. You'd come back here and drown in debt and sorrow with us." Arthur took a breath. "And she gave me one condition. The only way I was allowed to tell you about the boy." "What condition?" Mason demanded. "She said, if Mason ever comes back, look at his hand, look at his finger." Arthur pointed to Mason's left hand. It was bare. No ring, no tan line. She said, if he comes back with a wife, if he comes back happy, you take this secret to the grave, Dad. You let him live his life. Don't burden him with a dead girl's ghost and a child he didn't ask for." Arthur lowered his hand. "But if he comes back alone," Arthur's voice cracked. "If he comes back alone, it means he never let go. It means he's still ours." Mason looked at his empty hand, the hand that had worked for 4 years to earn a vengeance that was now meaningless. He hadn't moved on. He hadn't found someone else. He had built a fortress of money to protect a heart that still belonged to a dead girl in a white dress. "You came back alone, Mason," Arthur whispered. "So now you know." Mason turned to the window, staring at the black tar paper. His reflection was barely visible, a man in a $100,000 coat, standing in a room of death, realizing that his solitude was the key that unlocked his son. He didn't say a word. He turned around, walked past the display case, walked past the journal, and bent down. He scooped Arthur Vance up into his arms. The old man weighed nothing. He was light as bird bones and misery. Arthur gasped, clutching at Mason's shearling collar. "Mason, what are you doing?" "We're leaving," Mason said, his voice hard as steel, but vibrating with a new purpose. "I'm done reading history, Arthur. I'm going to get my son." Mason carried Arthur Vance out of the house as if the old man were a fragile sack of bones, a relic that had to be handled with extreme care. He didn't drop him. He didn't complain about the stench of bourbon and decay. He simply held him, a grim determination etched on his face. Mrs. Higgins, still perched on her porch like a frozen gargoyle, gasped as Mason emerged from the shattered doorway, cradling the emaciated form of Arthur. She fumbled with her cigarette, her jaw hanging slack. "Mason, what in God's name are you doing with that old fool?" she shrieked, her voice thin against the biting wind. "Did he finally snap? Is he dead?" Mason didn't spare her a glance. He walked past her, his eyes fixed on the Ram TRX idling in the driveway, its supercharged engine humming a low, powerful growl against the bleak landscape. He reached the truck, gently opened the passenger door, and eased Arthur into the heated leather seat. The old man, weak and bewildered, clutched at Mason's arm, his eyes wide. "Mason, where are we going?" "The bank." "The house," Arthur mumbled, still disoriented by the abrupt change. "The house can wait," Mason said, his voice flat but firm. He fastened the seatbelt around Arthur's frail body, making sure it was secure. He then slammed the door shut, the sound echoing with finality. Mason strode around to the driver's side, climbed in, and put the truck in gear. The Ram 1500 TRX roared, spewing gravel and slush, leaving Mrs. Higgins sputtering in its wake. The journey began. It was a treacherous ascent into the heart of the Appalachian Mountains. The winding roads, already notorious for their sharp curves and sheer drops, were now a lethal ballet of black ice and sleet. The freezing rain plastered itself against the windshield, turning the world outside into a blurred, distorted canvas of gray and white. The environment mirrored Mason's internal chaos. The violent wind howled like a banshee, mirroring the screams trapped in his chest. The black ice on the roads reflected the slippery, dangerous truth he had just uncovered. The impenetrable darkness of the mountains was nothing compared to the 4 years of self-imposed ignorance he had lived through. Inside the truck, the silence was heavy, thick with unspoken grief and desperate hope. Arthur, shivering despite the heated seats, kept glancing at Mason, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and profound relief. Mason drove with a white-knuckle intensity, his hands clamped to the steering wheel, knuckles white. Every turn, every skid, every near miss with a deer that darted across the road was a physical manifestation of his desperation. He wasn't driving to find a treasure now. He was driving to reclaim the last living piece of Lily. Every mile they climbed, Mason saw it more clearly. Every dollar he had made, every building he had erected, every deal he had crushed, it was all fueled by a lie he had forced himself to believe, a lie he had clung to like a drowning man to a broken plank. He had built an empire of hatred, a monument to a betrayal that never existed. And now, that empire felt like a hollow mockery. His success, once a source of bitter pride, now tasted like ash. He looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror, the hardened jaw, the cold eyes, the expensive coat. He had become the man he thought Lily had abandoned him for. He had become the kind of man she would have despised. Suddenly, the blinding sweep of his headlights caught something in the road ahead. A fallen tree. A massive oak, ripped from its roots by the ice and wind, lay sprawled across the narrow mountain road, an impassable barrier. Its branches, thick as Mason's thighs, clawed at the night sky. Arthur gasped. "We can't get through, Mason. We'll have to go back. It'll be hours before a crew can clear it." Mason didn't respond. He slammed on the brakes, the tires squealing on the ice, bringing the TRX to a shuddering halt, just inches from the fallen trunk. He threw open his door. The freezing sleet and wind immediately assaulted him, lashing at his face, stinging his eyes. He didn't care. He stalked to the front of the truck, his movements raw, feral. He pulled the heavy-duty winch cable from its housing, unspooling the thick steel rope, his fingers numb from the cold. He wrapped the cable around the thickest part of the tree trunk, securing it with savage force. He returned to the cab, flipped a switch, and the winch began to whine, pulling taut. But the tree was massive. The truck strained, tires spinning on the ice, the engine roaring in protest. The tree barely budged. Mason's eyes, burning with a frantic, desperate energy, fixed on the winch. He had to clear this. He had to. He wasn't turning back. He jumped out again. He grabbed the thickest part of the tree, ignoring the sharp branches tearing at his expensive coat. He dug his boots into the frozen earth. "Get out of the way, you son of a bitch!" he screamed at the tree, his voice hoarse, raw, swallowed by the storm. He pulled. He pushed. He felt muscles tear in his shoulders, felt the searing pain in his back. He screamed again, a guttural, primal sound of pure rage and grief, purging 4 years of hatred and misunderstanding into the unforgiving mountain night. With a final explosive heave, the tree trunk groaned, then slowly, agonizingly, began to slide. The winch cable screamed, the truck's tires found purchase, and with a final, violent lurch, the path was clear. Mason stumbled back into the truck, breathing heavily, covered in mud and sap and the blood from a dozen small cuts. His expensive shearling coat was ruined. He didn't give a damn. He drove on. The convent of Our Lady of the Mountains. They reached it at precisely 4 a.m. It was an ancient stone structure, barely visible through the swirling sleet, nestled deep in a secluded pine forest. A single weak light glowed from a window high above, a beacon in the desolate darkness. Mason killed the engine. The silence that descended this time wasn't heavy or suffocating. It was expectant, holy. He had arrived. The heavy iron knocker struck the oak door with a sound like a gavel dropping in an empty courtroom. Boom, boom, boom. Mason stood on the stone step, his chest heaving, his breath pluming in the freezing air like dragon smoke. He looked like a creature dredged up from the bottom of a swamp. His expensive shearling coat was torn and stained with mud and pine sap. Blood from the scratches on his face had dried into dark, crusty streaks. Beside him, Arthur leaned heavily against the stone archway, shivering violently, his eyes fixed on the wood grain as if praying for salvation. Mason raised his fist to hammer again, desperation clawing at his throat, but the heavy door creaked inward before he could strike. A slice of warm, yellow light cut across the snow, blinding them for a second. A nun stood in the opening. She was small, weathered, her face a map of wrinkles framed by a simple gray habit. She didn't flinch at the sight of the giant, bloodied man towering over her. She didn't look at the mud on his boots or the wildness in his eyes. Her gaze drifted past Mason's shoulder to the shivering, broken man beside him. "Arthur," she said softly, her voice carrying the quiet authority of stone. "You kept your promise." Arthur nodded weakly, tears freezing on his cheeks. "I brought him, Sister Margaret. He came back alone." Sister Margaret turned her eyes to Mason. There was no judgment in them, only a profound, heavy sadness. She stepped back, opening the door wide. "We have been praying for this night for 4 years, Mr. Thorne. Come in out of the cold." Mason stepped across the threshold. The transition was absolute. The howling wind and the biting sleet vanished, replaced by the smell of beeswax candles, old paper, and lemon polish. It was a silence so deep it felt like pressure in his ears. "This way," the sister said. They walked down a long stone corridor. Mason supported Arthur's weight, his boots leaving muddy prints on the pristine flagstones. He felt like an intruder, a barbarian bringing the filth of the world into a sanctuary. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a frantic rhythm that drowned out the soft swish of the nun's habit. They stopped at a plain wooden door at the end of the hall. Sister Margaret placed a hand on the latch. She looked up at Mason. "He is not a baby anymore, Mason. He has lived 4 years waiting for a father he only knows from paper." She opened the door. The room was small, warm, and simple. A single nightlight cast a soft glow. In the corner there was a sturdy wooden bed, not a crib. Mason stepped inside. The air here smelled of clean cotton and milk. He approached the bed as if walking through a minefield, terrified that one wrong step would detonate his reality. There, under a heavy wool quilt, a boy was sleeping. Mason stopped. He stopped breathing. He stopped thinking. The boy was small, his dark hair messy against the white pillow. He was curled on his side, one hand tucked under his cheek. As if sensing the shift in the room's gravity, the boy stirred. He rolled over, his eyes fluttered open. Mason braced himself for a scream. He expected the child to recoil from the bloodied, terrifying stranger standing in the dark. But the boy didn't scream. He blinked, sitting up slowly, rubbing sleep from his eyes with a fist. He looked at Mason. It was like looking into a mirror that reflected the past and the future simultaneously. The boy had Mason's square, stubborn jaw. He had the same furrowed brow, the same serious, contemplative set to his mouth. But his eyes, even in the dim light, Mason saw them. They were blue. They were wide, intelligent, and shaped exactly like Lily's. "Who are you?" the boy whispered. His voice was raspy with sleep, but steady. He didn't sound afraid. He sounded curious. Sister Margaret stepped forward quietly. She held out a piece of paper, a collage taped to a piece of cardboard. Mason took it. His hands shook so hard the paper rattled. It was 2 photos taped together. One was the picture of Lily from the hospice room, smiling in her wheelchair. The other was a clipping cut from a Forbes magazine article, a photo of Mason in a hard hat, standing in front of a steel skeleton of a skyscraper, looking fierce and unstoppable. Under the photos, written in crayon, was a word: the Builder. Mason looked from the paper to the boy. The boy's eyes widened. He looked at the paper in Mason's hand, then back at Mason's face. He studied the blood, the mud, the scar on Mason's chin. He seemed to be measuring the reality against the legend. "You're big," the boy said softly. Mason's voice failed. He cleared his throat, trying to find words in a vocabulary that had only consisted of contracts and threats for years. I'm Mason." The boy nodded solemnly. He pointed a small finger at the photo. "Mama said the Builder would come," Scout said, his voice matter of fact, filled with the absolute faith of a child who has been told a prophecy. "She said he had to fix the house first. Is the house ready?" The wall Mason had built around his heart, the fortress of money, the armor of indifference, the steel-reinforced concrete of his rage didn't just crack. It disintegrated. The realization that Lily hadn't just died saving their son, but had spent her dying breaths building Mason up as a hero in the boy's mind, brought Mason to his knees. He fell to the floor beside the bed, eye level with his son. The man who destroyed unions and moved mountains buried his face in the quilt. A sob tore out of him, a sound so raw and broken it seemed to shake the stone walls. "Yes," Mason wept, the tears cutting through the blood on his face. "Yes, the house is ready. I promise. The house is ready." Scout hesitated for only a second. Then he reached out. His small, warm hand touched Mason's muddy hair. It was a clumsy gesture, tentative but brave. Mason looked up, blinded by tears, and pulled the boy into his arms. He held him fiercely, breathing in the scent of life, feeling the small, steady heartbeat against his own chest. It was the first time Mason Thorne had held anything of value in 4 years. He wasn't holding a child, he was holding his forgiveness. He was holding the flesh and blood proof that he had been loved, even when he didn't deserve it. "I'm here, Scout," Mason whispered into the boy's hair. "I'm here." The Ram TRX descended the mountain pass just as the first bruised purple light of dawn began to bleed over the horizon. The storm had broken, leaving behind a world encased in crystal. The trees were dipped in glass, and the black asphalt of the winding road steamed as the sun hit the ice. Inside the cab, the heater hummed, a warm counterpoint to the frozen world outside. Scout was asleep in the back seat, wrapped in Mason's ruined, blood-stained shearling coat. Arthur sat in the passenger seat, watching the familiar silhouette of Blackwood Creek rise from the mist. He didn't look like a prisoner anymore. He looked like a man returning from a long exile. Mason drove with one hand on the wheel. His other hand rested on the center console, close enough that he could reach back and check Scout's breathing every few minutes. The rage that had fueled the engine of this truck the night before was gone, replaced by a quiet, terrified exhaustion. He wasn't the predator returning for the kill. He was a father bringing his pack home. They rolled into town at 7 a.m. Blackwood Creek was waking up. The few diners were turning on their neon signs. Pickups were idling in driveways, exhaust plumes rising like white pillars. Mason didn't drive to the motel. He drove straight to the rotting Victorian carcass on the hill. He killed the engine. The silence of the morning was absolute, save for the distant caw of a crow. Mrs. Higgins was there, of course. She was practically a fixture of the porch next door, clutching her coffee mug, her eyes widening as she saw the monster truck return. She watched as Mason stepped out. He looked like a wreck. The millionaire builder was covered in dried mud, pine sap, and blood, but he moved with a calm, deliberate power. He walked to the passenger side and opened the door. He didn't shout. He didn't demand. He reached in and gently helped Arthur Vance down. Arthur leaned heavily on Mason, his duct-taped leg dragging in the snow, but he held his head up. Then Mason opened the back door. He lifted the sleeping boy into his arms. Mrs. Higgins dropped her mug. It shattered on her porch, the sound sharp in the cold air. She stared at the child, the dark hair, the blue eyes, the ghost of Lily Vance. "Mason?" she called out, her voice trembling. Who is that?" Mason didn't answer her directly. He carried his son to the front yard where a rusted metal burn barrel stood half buried in the snow, a monument to the trash Arthur couldn't afford to haul away. Mason gently set Scout down, letting the boy stand in the snow in his oversized socks, holding his hand firmly. "Stay close, Scout," Mason murmured. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled, damp foreclosure notice he had ripped off the fence post. He stared at the legal threat, the piece of paper that said, "This home, this history, was worth nothing more than a bank ledger entry." He took a silver lighter from his pocket, flicked it, and held the flame to the corner of the paper. It caught instantly. He dropped the burning notice into the rusted barrel. Then he walked back to the truck. He grabbed the tactical duffel bag. The zipper was still open. The stacks of $100 bills, the ransom, the hush money, the symbol of everything he thought he had to buy glinted in the morning light. He walked back to the barrel. Arthur gasped. "Mason, that's the future." "No," Mason said. Looking at the boy clinging to his leg, "That's the past." He reached into the bag. He grabbed a brick of cash, $10,000. He tossed it into the fire. Mrs. Higgins screamed, "Are you insane? That's money!" Mason grabbed another brick, and another. He tossed the $50,000, the exact price Arthur had once demanded, into the flames. The fire roared, fueled by the currency of Mason's hatred. The green paper curled, blackened, and turned to ash, rising into the cold sky. He turned to the gawking neighbor, his voice ringing out across the quiet valley, clear and undeniable. "This house isn't for sale, Gladys," Mason declared, "and the Vance family isn't in debt to anyone, not the bank, not the past, and certainly not to me." He zipped the bag back up, keeping the rest for the lumber, the glass, and the roof, and turned his back on the fire. 6 months later. The sound of a hammer striking a nail rang out. Clack, clack, thud, a steady rhythmic heartbeat in the summer afternoon. Scaffolding wrapped around the Vance farmhouse like a protective exoskeleton. The rotting gray wood was gone, replaced by fresh cedar siding that smelled of resin and life. The windows were new, gleaming in the sunlight, no longer blacked out with tar paper. On the roof, Mason Thorne sat straddling the peak, sweat soaking through his t-shirt. He wasn't wearing a Patek Philippe. He was wearing a tool belt. "Hold it straight, Scout," Mason said gently, guiding a small hand. Scout, now wearing a miniature hard hat and a tool belt that hung down to his knees, held a shingle in place with fierce concentration. "Like this, Dad. Just like that. Now drive it home." Arthur Vance sat on the newly rebuilt porch below. His leg was in a proper medical boot now, resting on the rail. He held a mug of steaming coffee, listening to the music of construction above. He wasn't guarding a tomb anymore. He was watching a resurrection. The sun beat down on the valley, melting the last lingering memories of the snow. A warm breeze rushed through the trees, carrying the scent of sawdust and, faintly, the smell of wild lavender growing near the creek. Mason wiped the sweat from his brow and looked down at his son, then at the old man on the porch. He had spent 4 years trying to build an empire to forget a girl. It took him losing everything to realize that the only thing worth building was a home for the boy she left behind. The debt was paid, the snow was gone, and from the ash, something new had finally begun to grow. The debt of snow and ash serves as a brutal reminder that hate is often a blindfold, preventing us from seeing the quiet sacrifices made in our name. Mason's journey reveals that the narratives we construct to protect our egos, stories of betrayal and greed, can be far more damaging than the truth. True love isn't always found in grand gestures of presence, but sometimes in the agonizing choice to leave. Ultimately, the story teaches us that wealth is meaningless when the soul is bankrupt, and that the only legacy worth building is one rooted in forgiveness, not vengeance. Now, if you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know which part surprised you the most. Every subscription and comment from you is a huge motivation for us to keep sharing more meaningful stories in life. Thank you so much.